We're on chapter 9, section 8, and we're talking about buffers and the blood. This is really, really important. It's called the bicarbonate buffer system. And this is what keeps our pH of our blood at that physiological solution, right? And so anything that has a weak acid and its conjugate base is called a buffer. And buffers are there to resist changes in pH. If you add a little bit of acid, a little bit of base, it's okay because they'll basically soak up that extra acid or base and keep the pH at the same. And so it's important that your buffer system is at a place where their pKa is equal to the pH. That means you have equal amount of weak base to its conjugate acid, or weak acid to its conjugate base, right? So the bicarbonate system is basically what buffers our blood. And so we have dissolved carbon dioxide, right? And you undergo cellular respiration, your cells make carbon dioxide as a waste product, it travels through the bloodstream, and we exhale it. But even though we have that carbon dioxide that's dissolved in our blood, it actually equilibrates with water, and it has an acid-base reaction with water, and it forms carbonic acid. And then that further dissociates to form what are called bicarbonate ions. So technically, our carbon dioxide can't act as an acid because it doesn't have any protons. But our protons are really coming from our water, right? And so it's important to understand what's happening inside of the bloodstream in terms of what's going to change the pH of our body, right? And we know that we have to maintain homeostasis no matter what, right? And so you can see this manifesting if somebody starts to hyperventilate. If you hyperventilate, that means you have too much carbon dioxide gas that's built up in your bloodstream. The more carbon dioxide gas you have, the more hydronium ion builds up in this bicarbonate equilibrium that we talked about. And so your blood becomes acidic. And sometimes you'll hear that called respiratory acidosis, right? And so you can treat respiratory acidosis by giving an IV bicarbonate. So you're basically giving an IV buffer to help the patient's blood to buffer itself, right? And so if you're hyperventilating, that means you're actually exhaling too much carbon dioxide from the lungs. And so what this in essence does is it has all this extra carbon dioxide has reaction with the water. And so it draws that hydronium ion from the bloodstream and it makes the blood basic. This condition is known as respiratory alkydosis. And so respiratory alkydosis can be reversed by putting a bag over the person's mouth and having them inhale and exhale into the bag. And when they inhale, right, they're going to inhale oxygen, but also the CO2 that they already exhaled. If they did that, then they're going to keep some of that CO2 that they exhaled and pull it back in, right? And so you've basically, the problem is that you're expelling too much carbon dioxide. Well, if you put the bag over the mouth, then you're going to basically reuse the carbon dioxide that you exhaled to bring that carbon dioxide concentration back to where it should be. And so your book goes into all the different symptoms and stuff like that. I'm not going to test you on that. You'll get that later, I'm sure. But there are all kinds of different chemical reactions that can occur inside of your body to change the pH of your blood. And it's going to end up being too much or too little of that hydronium ion. Another example is when diabetics typically use fatty acids as a carbon source for energy production, right? Because they don't respond to sugars. So if they undergo a lot of fatty acid metabolism, right, breakdown, you're going to, as a byproduct, produce acid. Well, this can cause what's called metabolic acidosis. Metabolic acidosis can be treated similarly with an intravenous bicarbonate. And so you can also get this even if you're not a diabetic. If you have excessive vomiting, this will actually result in the same thing. And so you need to lower the pH of the person's blood, and you can give them something like ammonium chloride, something that's going to go ahead and lower that pH. You know, you're too basic, you're going to go ahead and lower that pH. If you have metabolic alkalosis, right? So that's for the opposite. Metabolic acidosis is where we have too much acid being produced. Metabolic alkalosis is when you have not enough, right? So it's all about a balance. You don't want to have too much. You don't want to have not enough. So we know that maintaining this equilibrium between our bicarbonate system is super, super important in the bloodstream, right? Another example is if you have a patient who has an asthma attack, right? They can't breathe, they struggle to breathe. And so they're not exhaling as much carbon dioxide as they should. So the level of carbon dioxide in their bloodstream will actually increase. And this results in respiratory acidosis. So the body's going to adjust. The body is going to change the concentration of bicarbonate inside of the bloodstream. And so that's going to restore our pH balance of what it should be. And we call that process compensation. But there's only so much that the body can do, right? And if you do start this compensation, right, then you're also going to probably trigger the kidneys to decrease their level of bicarbonate, right? And then you'll actually buffer your blood that way. So either way, if you have too much, you have not enough CO2, your body can adjust a little bit, not a whole lot, but enough that you'll keep that normal physiological pH, right? Hold on. So the other more common way that your body is going to adjust CO2 levels is by just changing how quickly you breathe, right? Your brain is constantly monitoring how much CO2 is in your bloodstream. And so if your CO2 levels get too high, what happens is the brainstem is going to go, oh, you need to breathe some more. And so you're actually going to increase your rate of breathing. This is what happens when you exercise, right? When you're just sitting there, you have a certain breathing rate, but if you go and do exercise, your breathing rate is going to increase so that you can then lower your CO2 levels again. So that's a really common way that the body handles that change in carbon dioxide. So let's go do some problems. All right, so here we have our problem. We're under stress, we're under trauma, we start to hyperventilate. So you're going to give that person that bag and breathe into the bag to avoid fainting. So how does our blood pH change when we hyperventilate? Well, we know that this is going to lower our CO2 levels, right, in the blood. So what happens when you lower CO2 levels? You're going to lower your concentration of that ion, that hydronium ion. And what happens then is that you increase your blood pH. So you become basic, right? All right, in which direction will the bicarbonate equilibrium shift during hyperventilation? Well, what are you actually doing? We just said you decrease CO2. So decreasing CO2 is what we do, right? So we decrease a reaction, a reactant. What is the reaction going to do? The reaction is going to want to increase the CO2. And so the equilibrium is going to shift towards the reactants, right? So you're going to have a left shift. So here is a left shift. Okay. So what do we call this condition? We call this respiratory alkalosis. Okay. Now, D, how does breathing into a paper bag help return blood pH to normal? So I'm going to come down here and say this. All right. So what do? When we breathe into a bag, we are inhaling more CO2. So you inhale more CO2. If you inhale more CO2, that means we are increasing our reactants. Well, what is the reaction going to do? Reaction will want to decrease reactants. And so we're going to shift reaction to the right now, right? So this is the opposite. So then how's that going to affect the blood, right? How's it going to return our blood pH to normal? Well, now we're going to make more H3O plus, more hydronium ion. Well, what does that do? That lowers our blood pH. Okay. E, in which direction will the bicarbonate equilibrium shift? We already said that, right? Here, and we're going to shift to the right. So we already said that. We used it in our description. Okay. All right, that's it. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Oh, don't know what I'm doing. Y'all have a good day.